Greetings once again from the brother from Harlem with the high school education. I talked a little in the last segment about the changing scene on 125th Street and Harlem to a point, but mainly 125th Street. What was happening now? Well, after the assassination of Martin Luther King, the world took a different view on a lot of things. Vietnam War was still going on, like I had mentioned. But here's what happened on 125th Street. The acts that used to come through the Apollo Theater started to fall off. Why? Well, Martin Luther King opened up a new era for us to a point. People became more and more aware of the struggle that was going on in the South, especially in Harlem, because there were a lot of things about what he was going through in the South and what Southerners were going through was kind of foreign to us to a point. Well, what happened on 125th Street was the Apollo Theater, because you see, now these acts could go and perform in other places that they just didn't perform in before. Like I said, they could go to Vegas, they could go downtown to the Rainbow Room and places of that nature. They could go to areas where they just couldn't go before. Well, they could. So what happens? Some of your key figures started to fall off from going to the Apollo Theater. Now, the Apollo Theater operated on a 50-week-a-year base. They closed 2 weeks during the summer to freshen up the Apollo. I just put it to you that way. Clean it up, maybe need a little paint over here, a new chair over here, whatever. But they closed. So they operated on a 50-week basis. And most of the time they had 50 weeks covered. How did they have them covered? Well, you take for instance James Brown. James Brown came about 4 times a year. Motown came about 4 times a year during this time. Now they built it up to this. It wasn't always this full, but they had built it up by now to this point. Then you had other groups. You had Stax Record Review. They came 3 or 4 times a year. You had the Philly Sound. They came 3 or 4 times a year. You had a guy like James Cleveland. He came 3 or 4 times a year. You had a Jewel Box Review. They came 3 or 4 times a year. And then you had some other reviews. Some of them came once a year. Some of them came twice a year. Then you had different acts that were booked. They would take a week that they could get and they would book it for a week. So you had those 50 weeks just about covered. Now, when the universe opened up to black entertainment, I'll just put it to you that way, what that meant was now some of these acts didn't have to follow the Chitlin circuit like they were following. Now you take, for argument's sake, Motown. Motown was going to Vegas and the Rainbow Room and all of these places now where they didn't go before. This was the crossover in music. So Motown pulled out. That knocked 4 weeks out. Then you had popular groups that were now crossed over. And the Philadelphia Review, and you take Stax Record Review, they started pulling back on the weeks. So the 50 weeks now weren't 50 anymore. And it dropped down to 45 weeks, 40 weeks, 35 weeks, got around 30 weeks. Well, up until a point, the Schiffmans, Frank Schiffman, his son Bob, ran the day-to-day, Bob Schiffman, they continued to pay these people. I know for a fact they paid these people for a while, and then it became too costly for them to pay for them doing nothing, because you didn't have anything booked this week, but they paid these people for a while. Then all of a sudden, as weeks dropped, or as the artists dropped out and the work pool got smaller and smaller, now they couldn't pay them. So now they would let them go for that week, but they couldn't pay them. Then it got down to a point where it became almost impossible to continue to keep these people on payroll when you went from 50 weeks and now you're down into 30 weeks. When you think about paying an entire staff for a week of work and they're not there, now we're talking about a staff of a theatrical venue that had, outside of the people who worked the front, the cameras, the audio, the lights, the people who clean the theater, they have nothing to do. So it just got to a point where there were so few, there wasn't a few weeks left, but the amount of weeks that they needed to operate when they had been operating on roughly a 50-week a year schedule, it didn't become profitable to the shipments anymore. I know that for a fact because I was there. And they would come and talk to us about how things were dwindling down. Now, I always give a lot of credit to James Brown, James Cleveland, the Jewel Box Review. I give credit to them for one reason alone. James was playing big arenas now. He didn't have to come back to the Apollo Theater. James Cleveland still kind of needed the Apollo Theater as a venue for him to play, but he stuck it out. The Jewel Box Review, well, it doesn't matter where, they were playing everywhere anyway, so, but they stuck it out. But the rest of them, Motown and the Stax, and this review and that review, they started dropping off. And all of a sudden, there were weeks when the Apollo would just be closed. Because like I said, the shows ran from Friday to the next Thursday. A new show started every Friday. People started to look for the Apollo, the different reviews, because trust me, they were booked all the time. When they were booked all the time, the people came all the time. Now all of a sudden, the people really don't have that much to do anymore. There are weeks when 125th Street was not deserted, but a lot of people came to the Apollo Theater and also shopped on 125th Street. Now all of a sudden, that started to dwindle. The hustlers weren't coming up to the Apollo like they used to, because they'd come up there, the hustlers were in there watching the shows like everything else. They didn't necessarily live up there. So the people who didn't live up there, all of a sudden, you don't have them anymore. Frank Shipman came into the Tailor shop one day, and Ori and I were in there, and he came up to us and he said, he was talking to my boss Ori, but I was right there next to Ori when he said this. He said, Ori, he said, Dad and I decided that we can't keep the Apollo running anymore. We're going to close it down. This was 1972. Now through everything they had been through riots, through the good, the bad, and everything else, it just got to the point where they just couldn't keep it open. And I understand, because if you do the math and you go from 50 to into the 30s, it doesn't work anymore. It just doesn't work. It doesn't work. So you have to think back and say to yourself, we can't keep it open. The Shipmans were very, very wealthy. You got to remember, Frank Shipman was running the Apollo Theater since 1934. Here we are in 1970 something. So double the amount of time from when he bought it to then, he made plenty of money. Plenty money. He didn't live in Harlem anyway, and he was an older man. Bob was right in his, about 50. They had other things that they could do. So they decided to close it up. Thus then, listen to me, was the demise of the Apollo Theater. From the economic standpoint, where it didn't become profitable anymore, and they were taking losses, and they couldn't take it. So I'm not mad at them for closing. I'm just saying that the civil rights movement hurt the Apollo Theater in so many words, because the entertainers that were loyal to the Apollo Theater, where they gained fame and fortune coming through the Apollo Theater, had just abandoned it, that's all. I mean, economics is economics, you can't get around that. So I want to let you guys think about that. That's why the Apollo Theater closed, because they couldn't keep enough acts booked. It's as simple as that. Now, that was never spouted out in the news. There was no big press conference about that. That's coming because Ori and I were there in his tailor shop when they said, we can't do it anymore. We're closing down. So, for the people who didn't know, that was some of the main reasons. So, at any rate, brother from Harlem, high school education, giving you that little tidbit on why the Apollo Theater closed. It's not my law. I didn't write it down or anything. I'm just telling you by being there, seeing what's happened. So once again, I'll be back with you with probably the last segment of this series, because this is coming to an end. And it was coming to an end for me being there. And I'll talk about that later. So bye for now. Gentleman Jim, brother from Harlem with high school education. Be blessed.